Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the surface of history, there are stories that never wanted to be told, stories whispered in shame, buried in small-town soil, and locked away in family Bibles that have long since gathered dust. Tonight, we unearth one of them. A tale of bloodlines tangled beyond recognition, where a young woman was not just a bride, but also a niece, and where the man who took her hand in marriage was not only her husband, but her uncle. Their union was not built on love as the world knows it, but on desperation, secrecy, and a family so closed in on itself that escape was no longer possible. She gave birth to his child, and with it carried forward one of the darkest chapters of inbreeding ever recorded in American history. What you are about to hear is not legend nor fiction. It is a truth so disturbing that those who lived it never spoke of it again. To understand how such a marriage could have ever been possible, we must step back in time into a world far more isolated than ours today. In the hidden corners of America's rural towns, families were often all they had. Roads were unpaved, churches served as the only source of order, and neighbors were often more than kin. They were lifelines. But in these closed-off communities, bloodlines folded inward. Cousins married cousins, sisters were bartered, and sometimes a niece was handed to an uncle in a twisted exchange that blurred every moral line. To survive was to keep it all in the family, no matter the cost. This story begins with a girl raised in silence, a girl who never had two. He chanced to choose her fate. Her mother's warnings were hushed, her father's shadow loomed heavy, and her uncle's gaze lingered longer than it should have. What began as protection turned into possession, and what should have been a childhood slipped into something much darker. By the time she was of age, there was no question of who she would marry. Her uncle, older, controlling, and bound by blood, claimed her as his bride. The child that followed was not just born of secrecy, but of shame. And yet, the town looked away, because in places like this, silence was the strongest law of all. The wedding was not a celebration, it was a transaction, a gathering held not in grandeur but in the dim stillness of a wooden church where the pews creaked louder than the vows themselves. Neighbors attended, though none spoke above a whisper. They all knew what they were witnessing, yet no one dared to call it by its name. To them, she was a young bride, perhaps too young, but marriage was often a sentence handed down rather than a choice freely made. And he, her uncle, stood tall with the air of a man who believed what he was taking was rightfully his. The bride's eyes never rose from the ground. She wore no crown of flowers, no veil of innocence, only the heavy weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. Behind closed doors, her family had told her this was her duty, that keeping blood within blood would preserve their name, their land, their control. To her, it felt more like a prison built out of scripture twisted to fit their purpose. A Bible verse here, a whispered justification there, until what was forbidden was dressed as holy. In small towns, reputation often outweighed morality. A scandal could ruin not just a family, but an entire community's fragile balance. And so, the people watched silently as vows were exchanged between niece and uncle, their stares betraying what their tongues refused to admit. Some shifted uncomfortably in the pews, while others hardened their gaze, choosing denial over confrontation. To acknowledge it aloud was to risk being dragged into the same swamp of sin. When the preacher's voice declared them man and wife, the air grew heavy, as if the church itself recoiled at the words. For the bride, it was the death of her girlhood. For the groom, it was victory. For the child yet unborn, it was the beginning of a life marked by whispers, stares, and a name that could never be fully cleansed. What followed the ceremony was not joy, but silence. No music played, no laughter filled the air. The guests filed out quickly, each carrying with them the burden of what they had witnessed. The bride was led away by her uncle, now her husband, and with each step, the world she once dreamed of slipped further out of reach. The home they entered together was not built on love, but on control, a wooden cabin at the edge of town, surrounded by fields that stretched into emptiness. For outsiders, it was a symbol of stability, a man providing for his new wife, a family ready to continue its lineage. But for her, those walls became a tomb. Inside, there were no neighbors to glance away, no churchgoers to pretend ignorance. There was only him, his presence heavy, his will absolute. Her uncle had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. As a child, he had carried her on his shoulders, sat at the same table, shared the same prayers. But once she became his bride, his role shifted into something far more sinister. The hand that once patted her head now gripped her wrist. The voice that once offered guidance now demanded submission. What had seemed like family affection revealed itself as something darker, long harbored beneath the surface. The nights were the worst. In the stillness of that cabin, she lay awake, knowing that the footsteps outside her door always stopped too soon, that the latch always turned whether she wanted it to or not. Each morning she would rise with hollow eyes, carrying the weight of a secret that everyone already knew, but no one dared to name. She was no longer simply a niece, nor merely a wife. She had become both at once, trapped in a cycle where innocence and corruption blurred beyond recognition. When her body began to change, when life began to grow within her, the whispers outside grew sharper. The townsfolk would see her walking through the fields, her belly rounding, her head bowed. They muttered to one another, their voices low, but always loud enough for her to hear. Some pitied her, some judged her, but most simply turned away, as if averting their eyes could absolve them of complicity. Her uncle-husband, however, carried himself with pride. To him the child was proof. Proof of his power, proof of his lineage, proof that what he had done was not only possible but fruitful. He boasted in small ways, through his posture, through the way he spoke of their family continuing. But behind his arrogance was something far more fragile, the fear of exposure. For though the town was silent, silence was not the same as acceptance. When the child was born, silence turned into something sharper. The cries of the infant echoed through the small cabin, a sound that should have brought joy, but instead carried the weight of unease. Those who caught glimpses of the baby could not help but notice what was different: eyes that did not focus, a jaw too small, features that seemed both familiar and distorted. It was as if the blood had folded too tightly upon itself, leaving behind a mark that could not be hidden. The mother, still a girl in many ways, looked upon her child with a mixture of love and dread. She cradled the infant close, whispering lullabies no one else would ever hear, but in her silence she carried the unbearable knowledge of what this life represented. Her uncle-husband, on the other hand, looked at the child as if it were a mirror of himself, proof that his name would continue even when it was already corrupted from within. The town spoke less openly now. Instead of whispers, there were glances, sidelong stares, and doors quietly shut as the family passed by. Some avoided the sight of the child altogether, while others watched with a kind of morbid fascination. They told themselves it was not their place, that what happened in another's home was no business of theirs, but deep down, each of them knew that the sickness growing in that house was not confined to its walls. It was a sickness of silence, a rot that had taken root in the soil of the community itself. For the bride, each day stretched endlessly. She tended to her child while her uncle loomed ever near, his pride festering into jealousy, his control hardening into cruelty. He did not allow her visits to neighbors, did not allow her letters, did not allow her dreams. She was his possession, and now so was the child. The cabin became a fortress of secrecy, its windows dark, its doors heavy, its walls thick with unspoken truths. Yet despite the darkness, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, when she would hold her baby and imagine another life. A life where the man she married was not the same man who had once tucked her into bed as an uncle. A life where her child was not burdened with the sins of its parents. But those moments faded quickly, replaced by the cold reality of footsteps approaching, of a door creaking open, of a voice that reminded her she was never truly free. Time in that house did not move forward. It circled endlessly, like a clock with no hands. The seasons changed outside. The fields shifted from green to brown to frost. But inside the cabin, everything remained the same. Silence, control, and the slow unraveling of a woman who had been forced to live two lives at once. She was wife and niece, mother and prisoner, alive but hollow. The child grew, but the marks of its birthright deepened. Each year made it harder for the family to ignore what was already known, that the bloodline had bent too far. The child's speech lagged behind, its movements clumsy, its health fragile. Neighbors noticed, even if they never spoke. Their stares lingered a little longer. Their conversation stopped abruptly when the family walked past. The community carried its guilt quietly, knowing that by doing nothing, they had allowed this fate to unfold. The uncle husband grew more possessive as the years passed. His fear of judgment hardened into anger, his pride curdled into paranoia. He forbade visits, forbade questions, forbade any sign that his family was anything less than what he insisted it to be. But the more he tried to control the narrative, the more cracks began to show. And those cracks spread, not just within the cabin walls, but across the entire town. By now, the bride no longer looked like a girl. Her face was lined not by age, but by grief. Every smile had long since vanished, every spark of hope extinguished. She existed only to serve, to tend, to obey. And yet, deep within her, there remained a flicker, a buried instinct that whispered she could not let this be her child's only inheritance. But how does one escape a prison that is not made of bars, but of blood? How does one flee from a husband who is also family, from a community that chooses silence over salvation, from a history written in shame? For her, every door seemed blocked, every path blocked by the same truth. There was nowhere to run where the blood would not follow. It is here, at this point in her life, that the story sharpens into tragedy, for when bloodlines twist too tightly, something always breaks, whether it is the mind, the body, or the fragile fabric of a family that was never meant to be joined in this way. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The breaking point came not with violence, but with a silence so heavy it could crush bone. One morning, the town awoke to rumors. The bride had been seen wandering the edge of the fields barefoot, her dress torn, her child clutched desperately to her chest. She didn't speak to anyone, only stared, as if her voice had been swallowed whole by years of suffering. By nightfall, she was gone again, dragged back into the cabin by the man who had bound her life to his. Those who saw it said nothing. They turned away, convincing themselves it was not their place, that families must tend to their own. But deep inside, each knew they had witnessed a cry for help, and each knew they had chosen silence over salvation. The child's health faltered more with every season. Fevers came and went, small ailments grew into lasting scars. The mother prayed over the infant in hushed tones, asking God to grant the child a chance at a life untainted by its origin. But her prayers went unanswered, or perhaps they were never heard, because the truth was undeniable. The union that brought this child into the world had already determined its fate long before its first breath. For the uncle husband, this decline was an insult, a shadow over the pride he had taken in forcing his family line inward. He began to isolate even further, keeping his wife and child behind closed doors, allowing no one to see, no one to question. His rage grew volatile, his control absolute. For the bride, escape now meant more than freedom. It meant survival. And yet every attempt at courage was met with the reminder that blood ties were chains, and chains cannot be broken by will alone. It was around this time that the town's silence became unbearable even to them. Whispers crept into sermons, rumors spread in hushed gatherings. Some said the child would not survive, others claimed the bride had gone mad, and still our own. Theirs insisted that God himself had cursed the family, but no one knocked on the cabin door. No one stepped inside. No one dared to intervene. And so the family remained locked away, 3 souls bound together in a house that had long since turned into a coffin. The bride clung to her child, the child clung to her, and the man clung to the illusion of control that was crumbling beneath his very hands. By the time the story reached its end, the line between man and monster had blurred beyond recognition. The uncle, once respected in the eyes of his neighbors, became little more than a shadow, a gaunt figure pacing the edges of his land, muttering to himself, consumed by fear that the world might finally see what he had done. His pride, once so loud, had collapsed into paranoia. He boarded the windows, kept the door bolted, and spoke only to his wife and child, as if the rest of the world no longer existed. Inside, the cabin grew colder, darker. Food became scarce, sickness lingered, and the air was thick with decay, not just of the body, but of the soul. The bride, who had once been a girl stolen of her future, was now a hollow woman, her face marked by sorrow too deep for tears. She lived for her child, and even that life was slipping away. Each cough, each fever, each frail breath was a reminder that what had been created in secrecy was destined to wither in silence. The town, too, began to change. What had once been silence out of complicity transformed into silence out of shame. No one wanted to admit they had watched this unfold, that they had stood by as a girl was given to her uncle, that they had seen a child born of it and done nothing. The cabin became a cursed landmark, a place passed by quickly, eyes averted. Parents warned their children not to ask questions, not to linger too long on the road that led past it. The family inside became ghosts long before death claimed them. When the end finally came, it came quietly. The child died first, its fragile body unable to withstand the burden placed upon it by blood too closely bound. The mother followed not long after, some say from grief, others whisper from a sickness she no longer had the will to fight, and the uncle, once so proud, once so unshakable, was left alone with nothing but the echo of what he had destroyed. He lived out his days in that same cabin, wandering its empty rooms, speaking to no one, feared by all, remembered by none. This story, buried in the cracks of America's forgotten past, is not just about one family. It is about what happens when silence becomes law, when bloodlines are treated as prisons, when entire communities choose to look away. It is about how easily horror can grow, not from monsters in the dark, but from men who convince themselves that sin is duty, and who force the innocent to bear the weight of it. And though the names have been erased, the truth remains. She gave birth to her uncle's child, and in doing so, carried forward a history that the soil itself has tried to swallow. But some stories cannot be buried. Some stories demand to be told, no matter how much they haunt us. Would you like me to also write you a haunting outro for this script? Something to close the video with lasting impact?